Hollywood gave you a cowboy. Strong jaw, clean shirt, leather that somehow never cracked, and a horse that always did exactly what it was told. He rides into town, saves the girl, shoots the villain, and disappears into a sunset so perfect it belongs on a postcard. Every single frame of that image is a lie. The real American cowboy smelled like death warmed over. His teeth were rotting out of his skull. His body was covered in parasites. He ate food that would make a prison cafeteria look like fine dining, and most of them died young, broke, and completely forgotten before they ever saw 40. These are 20 disgusting truths about real cowboys that will make you physically uncomfortable, and you will never watch a John Wayne movie the same way again. Subscribe to our channel and drop a like to help us out. On number 20, cowboys almost never bathed. The rugged cowboy stepping out of a river, shaking water from his hair, looking refreshed and ready for adventure. That scene exists in exactly one place: the imagination of a Hollywood screenwriter who never spent a single day on a cattle trail. Real cowboys on the Chisholm Trail or the Goodnight Loving Trail went weeks, sometimes months, without any kind of proper bath. Water on the frontier was for drinking and for the cattle. Wasting it on personal hygiene was considered almost offensive when you were responsible for keeping 2,000 head of livestock alive across 800 miles of dust and scrubland. The few times cowboys did wash, it was usually in whatever creek or river the herd happened to cross. No soap, no privacy, just a quick dunk in water that the cattle had likely just walked through upstream. By the end of a 3-month drive from Texas to Kansas, these men were caked in layers of sweat, dust, manure, and grease. The smell preceded them into town by a considerable distance. Saloon owners in cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene reportedly kept windows open year-round, specifically because of what walked through their doors at the end of drive season. On number 19, their clothes were crawling with parasites. You know that iconic image of the cowboy in his worn leather chaps and faded cotton shirt. What the paintings leave out is what was living inside that fabric. Lice infestations were so common among working cowboys that they were simply accepted as part of the job. Body lice, head lice, pubic lice. These men were hosting entire ecosystems in their clothing. At night, cowboys would sometimes hold their shirts over the campfire, not to dry them, but to burn off the worst of the infestation. You could hear the parasites popping in the flames. Bedbugs were another constant companion. The bedrolls cowboys carried were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned. After months of continuous use, these rolls became breeding grounds for insects that fed on human blood every single night. One cowboy's diary. From an 1876 cattle drive in New Mexico Territory, described spending an entire night unable to sleep because the crawling sensation across his body never stopped. He wrote that scratching only made it worse. By morning, his arms were bloody from his own fingernails. On number 18, cowboy food was genuinely horrifying. The romantic campfire scene with cowboys gathered around, eating hearty stew and fresh biscuits, is another complete fabrication. The reality of trail food would make a modern health inspector collapse on the spot. The standard cowboy diet consisted of 3 things: beans, hardtack, and coffee, day after day, week after week, sometimes for the entire 3 to 4 month duration of a cattle drive. The beans were often cooked in the same unwashed pot for the entire journey. The hardtack, a type of dense cracker that could survive months without spoiling, was frequently infested with weevils by the time it reached a cowboy's mouth. Most men learned to eat it in the dark so they would not have to see what they were chewing. Fresh meat was rare and usually came from cattle that had died on the trail from disease or injury. The chuck wagon cook would butcher whatever was available, regardless of how the animal had died or how long it had been dead. Food poisoning was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a regular feature of life on the trail. On number 17, dysentery was their constant companion. Here is something the Western genre has never once shown you. Cowboys spending significant portions of their workday dealing with violent gastrointestinal illness. The combination of contaminated water, spoiled food, and non-existent sanitation meant that dysentery and other intestinal diseases ripped through cattle drives constantly. Cowboys called it the quick step, the trots, or simply the flux. Whatever name they used, the experience was the same. Severe cramping, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, and the humiliation of being unable to control your own body while trying to do physically demanding work. There were no bathrooms on the open range, no privacy, no toilet paper. Men would dismount, walk a short distance from the herd, and handle their business in full view of anyone who happened to look their direction. During severe outbreaks, drives would lose days of progress because too many men were too sick to ride. Some cowboys died from dehydration caused by dysentery, their bodies unable to replace the fluids they were losing. On number 16, their teeth were rotting out of their heads. "Smile for the camera" was not a phrase that applied to the average working cowboy. Dental hygiene on the frontier ranged from non-existent to actively harmful. Toothbrushes existed in the 1800s, but almost no cowboy owned one or would have thought to use it. The combination of a sugar-heavy diet when sugar was available, tobacco use, and complete lack of dental care meant that tooth decay was nearly universal among working cowboys by their mid-20s. Rotten teeth were not just a cosmetic issue. Infected teeth caused abscesses that could spread to the jaw, the throat, and eventually the bloodstream. Men died from dental infections that today would be solved with a simple course of antibiotics. The only dental care available on the frontier was extraction. A fellow cowboy with a pair of pliers, a shot of whiskey for the pain, and absolutely no training would yank the offending tooth out. If you were lucky, it came out clean. If you were not lucky, the tooth shattered, the infection spread, and you were in serious trouble. On number 15, cowboys were mostly teenagers. The weathered, experienced cowboy with years of wisdom etched into his face is another Hollywood invention. The actual demographic reality of the American cowboy was much younger and much sadder. Most working cowboys were between 14 and 25 years old. Cattle ranching was a young man's work because it destroyed bodies so quickly that older men simply could not do it anymore. The physical demands, the injuries, The accumulated damage from years of hard riding and harder living pushed most men out of the profession before they reached 30. Many of these young cowboys were orphans, runaways, or boys from families too poor to feed them. They took the work because there was nothing else. No education, no prospects, no alternative. The average working cowboy made between $25 and $40 a month. For comparison, a factory worker in an eastern city made roughly the same, but slept in a bed, ate regular meals, and did not risk death by stampede every time a thunderstorm rolled through. On number 14, the cowboy hat was about survival, not style. The iconic Stetson, the wide-brimmed hat that defines the cowboy image, was not a fashion statement. It was a desperately needed piece of survival equipment, and it was often disgusting. Cowboys used their hats for everything. Shade from the sun, obviously, but also as a water bowl for their horses, a fan to encourage campfires, a pillow at night, and a signaling device during cattle drives. The same hat that touched their horse's mouth touched their face while they slept. These hats were never washed. Over months and years of continuous use, they accumulated sweat stains, grease, dust, and whatever else they came into contact with. A well-worn cowboy hat had a smell that was immediately recognizable and deeply unpleasant. The felt material also provided an excellent home for the same parasites that infested everything else a cowboy owned. Men would occasionally discover lice living in the inner band of their hats, feeding on the sweat and skin cells trapped in the fabric. On number 13, horse injuries were constant and gruesome. The relationship between a cowboy and his horse is romanticized as almost spiritual in Western mythology. The reality involved a lot more blood and broken bones. Horses on cattle drives worked in conditions that would be considered animal abuse by any modern standard. They were ridden for 10 to 15 hours a day across terrain that included rocks, prairie dog holes, river crossings, and unpredictable cattle. Injuries were not occasional accidents. They were a regular part of operations. Broken legs meant the horse had to be destroyed on the spot. A cowboy who lost his mount in the middle of a drive was in serious trouble, often forced to work on foot until a replacement could be found, or to double up with another rider, which exhausted both horses faster. Cowboys themselves suffered constant riding injuries, hernias from spending too many hours in the saddle, chronic back problems that lasted the rest of their lives, broken bones from falls that healed badly because there was no time to rest and no doctor to set them properly. On number 12, violence was pathetic, not heroic. The quick-draw duel at high noon. The saloon standoff where the hero outdraws three villains. The honorable gunfight where the better man wins. None of this happened with any regularity. Real violence on the frontier was ugly, clumsy, and usually involved alcohol. Cowboys who got into altercations were typically drunk, poorly armed, and terrible shots. The romanticized gunfighter with preternatural accuracy was a creation of dime novels, not reality. Most shooting incidents among cowboys were accidents, negligent discharges from poorly maintained weapons, drunken mistakes that ended lives over nothing, friendly fire during the chaos of a stampede. When violence was intentional, it was rarely face-to-face. Shootings happened from behind, from ambush, from positions of safety. The fair fight was a fantasy, Real men who wanted to harm other men did so in the most cowardly, practical way possible. Number 11. Racism was built into cowboy culture. The diverse, integrated cattle drive, where men of all backgrounds worked together as equals, is a relatively recent addition to the Western genre. The historical reality was far uglier. Approximately 1 in 4 cowboys was black or Mexican. These men did the same work, faced the same dangers, and received significantly less respect, less pay, and less opportunity for advancement. Black cowboys were often assigned the worst jobs on the drive. Riding drag, the position at the back of the herd where you spent all day breathing the dust kicked up by thousands of cattle hooves. This was the most physically miserable position, and it was disproportionately assigned to black workers. Segregation was often enforced in town. Black cowboys were barred from certain saloons, certain hotels, certain areas entirely. The freedom and equality that the frontier supposedly offered was heavily conditional on the color of your skin. On number 10, the chuck wagon was a biohazard on wheels. The chuck wagon, that rolling kitchen that kept the cattle drive fed, was glorified in countless westerns as the heart of the operation. In reality, it was a mobile food poisoning factory. The cook, usually a cowboy who could no longer ride effectively, prepared every meal in the same pot that was rarely, if ever, properly cleaned. Water for cooking came from whatever source was available, often the same rivers and creeks where cattle had just been watered. Flies were everywhere. Meat that had been sitting in the heat for hours was served to men whose immune systems were already compromised by exhaustion and dehydration. The wooden surfaces of the chuck wagon were never sanitized and provided excellent breeding grounds for bacteria. Food storage was minimal. Whatever supplies the wagon carried had to last until the next town, which could be weeks away. By the end of that period, flour had weevils, bacon had gone rancid, and coffee was the only thing that could be trusted, mostly because boiling water killed whatever was living in it. On number 9, cowboys died from diseases that should not have been fatal. The leading causes of death among working cowboys were not gunfights or stampedes. They were infections, diseases, and injuries that modern medicine would consider trivial. A cut that got infected could become septic within days. Without antibiotics, without proper wound care, without any understanding of germ theory, these men watched small injuries become life-threatening emergencies with terrifying speed. Pneumonia killed cowboys every winter. The combination of sleeping on the cold ground, inadequate clothing, and immune systems already weakened by poor nutrition made respiratory infections deadly. Typhoid fever swept through cattle towns regularly, spread by the same contaminated water that everyone shared. Men who survived one outbreak often died in the next. On number 8, the Code of the West was mostly fiction. That unwritten code of honor that supposedly governed cowboy behavior, loyalty, honesty, courage, respect for women. It makes for great screenwriting. It had very little to do with reality. Real cowboys stole from each other. They cheated at cards. They abandoned injured companions when helping would have been inconvenient. They behaved exactly like exhausted, underpaid, desperate young men in a lawless environment tend to behave. The Code of the West was invented after the fact by dime novelists and later by film studios who needed their heroes to have recognizable virtues. The actual ethics of the frontier were situational at best. On number 7, alcohol abuse was rampant and ugly. The cowboy enjoying a well-earned drink at the end of the trail is another sanitized image. The reality was widespread alcoholism and all the misery that comes with it. Cowboys spent months on the trail with nothing to drink but coffee and whatever water they could find. When they finally reached a cattle town, many of them drank with a desperation that went far beyond celebration. The whiskey available was often the same rotgut poison that destroyed livers and caused blindness. Men who had just survived 3 months of brutal work would spend their entire wages in a single weekend of binge drinking, then wake up broke, sick, and facing another season of the same grueling labor. Alcoholism destroyed cowboys who survived everything else the trail could throw at them. On number 6, sleeping conditions were genuinely awful. Cowboys slept on the ground, not in tents, not in shelters, on the actual ground, with nothing but a single bedroll between them and whatever was living in the soil. Snakes were a constant threat, scorpions in the southwest, fire ants, whatever insects or animals happened to inhabit the area where the drive stopped for the night. When it rained, cowboys slept in the rain. When it was cold, they slept in the cold. The bedroll provided minimal insulation and became a soggy, muddy weight during wet weather. Sleep itself was interrupted constantly. Cowboys worked in shifts, with some men always awake to watch the herd. Stampedes could start at any moment. A full night of uninterrupted rest was a luxury that rarely existed. On number 5, the smell of a cattle drive was overwhelming. 2,000 cattle produce an almost unimaginable amount of waste every single day for months at a time. Cowboys rode through this. They ate near it. They slept near it. The smell of manure, of animal bodies, of death when cattle died on the trail permeated everything. Add to that the unwashed bodies of the cowboys themselves, the rotting food, the general absence of any sanitation, and you begin to understand why cattle towns could smell an approaching drive from miles away. This was not a temporary inconvenience. It was the constant sensory reality of cowboy life. After weeks on the trail, cowboys reportedly became nose-blind to it. They stopped smelling themselves and their environment entirely. When they entered civilization, the reactions of everyone around them made the reality unavoidable again. On number 4, cowboys were essentially migrant laborers. Strip away the mythology, and what you have is a class of young, poor, expendable workers doing dangerous seasonal labor for minimal pay with no job security and no benefits. At the end of a cattle drive, cowboys were paid off and released. There was no year-round employment for most of them. They would drift from ranch to ranch, drive to drive, taking whatever work was available and facing unemployment every winter. The ranchers who employed them became wealthy. The cattle barons built empires. The cowboys who did the actual work rarely accumulated anything. They spent what they earned, faced another season of brutal labor, and did it again until their bodies gave out. On number 3, most cowboys did not carry guns like you think. The 6-shooter on every hip is mandatory in Western films and almost entirely fictional in historical reality. Revolvers were expensive. A working cowboy making $30 a month could not easily afford a quality handgun. Those who did own firearms often carried single-shot rifles for hunting, not the quick-draw pistols of legend. Many cattle towns had strict ordinances requiring visitors to check their weapons upon arrival. The image of armed cowboys walking the streets ready for action was exactly what these communities were trying to prevent. On number 2, the cowboy era was shockingly brief. The great cattle drives, the iconic period that defined the cowboy image forever, lasted approximately 20 years. From the mid-1860s, after the Civil War, to the mid-1880s, when railroads, barbed wire, and changing economics made the long drive obsolete. 20 years, that is it. An entire mythology built on 2 decades of labor performed by a few thousand young men, most of whom died forgotten. Number 1. Most cowboys ended up broken and abandoned. Here is the truth that no Western film will ever show you. What happened to these men when the trail ended for good? Cowboys who survived their working years emerged with damaged bodies, no savings, no skills that translated to the changing economy, and no safety net. Many became homeless drifters. Others found work as ranch hands at even lower wages. Some drank themselves to death in the same cattle towns where they had once spent their earnings. There are no monuments to the average cowboy, no pensions, no recognition. The men who built the mythology through their actual labor disappeared into poverty and obscurity, while dime novelists and later Hollywood transformed their suffering into entertainment. The cowboy you grew up watching was a character. The men he was based on lived short, brutal, dirty lives and received nothing for it except a legend that got their story completely wrong. Every disgusting detail in this list was daily reality for thousands of young men who had no other options. The parasites, the illness, the poverty, the racism, the exploitation. That was the American cowboy. Hollywood gave you the sunset. History gave you the truth. If any of these facts changed how you see the Old West, tell me which one in the comments. Like this video if you think more people need to hear what actually happened out there. Subscribe because we are just getting started. And next time, we are looking at what frontier justice actually meant. What happened when the law showed up in these towns, and why it was sometimes worse than having no law at all. Stay with us.